Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, any other agency of the U.S. government, or any other entities with which our guests here today might be affiliated. So today's episode merges two areas that we here at the Krulak Center care about, and we've done a lot of previous episodes on, and that's wargaming and China. Earlier this month, the Center for Strategic and International Studies presented a report on a series of war games they ran, which simulated an attempted Chinese amphibious assault on the island of Taiwan. The results of these games generated much discussion about deterrence, defense against amphibious assault, and the cost such an invasion might impose on all parties involved. Taking us through these topics are Matthew Cancian, PhD, the game's designer, and Mr. Dan Rice, who's our own Team Krulak China subject matter expert, who participated as a player in one of the games. So Matthew Cancian is a Marine veteran and an MIT PhD who studies military operations at the Naval War College as a contractor for Salex Solutions. He received his PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2022, where he concentrated in security studies and comparative politics. His thesis was about the motivations of combatants and the effects of training based on a survey of 2,301 Kurdish Peshmerga fighters during their war against the Islamic State. He also holds a master's in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School and a BA in history from the University of Virginia. He was a captain of Marines and deployed to Sangin, Afghanistan as a forward observer in 2011 in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. And then we welcome back to his second appearance on the Brewcast, Mr. Dan Rice, who is our China military and political subject matter expert at the Krulak Center. He also serves as a non-resident fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and is the COO of the open source geopolitical intelligence company Foreign Brief. He holds a master's in strategic studies from Johns Hopkins SIAS and is a graduate of the Hopkins Nanjing Center. He previously lived in China and speaks fluent Mandarin. So, gentlemen, thank you both for your time today, and really excited for this discussion because the games and the outcomes in the report have definitely caught a lot of attention because this is one of the sort of the big problem sets that DOD as well as us in the Marine Corps here specifically, looking at very closely. So I look forward to a great discussion. And then to Matt, I'll turn it over to you for getting us going.
Hey, thanks so much, Ian, for having me on here. So I have run this series of war games over the last year with my co-authors, Mark Cancian, my dad, who was a retired colonel, and Eric Higginbotham, who was in the Army many moons ago and is now at MIT and is probably known for his study while he was at RAND, the U.S.-China Military Scorecard. So Eric and I have been designing and running this game for several years now, so it was great to have the opportunity to go through this series with CSIS and to play with great people like Dan. So I'll give a brief overview about the project first, and then we'll before going into our Q&A here. So there's the project, how we designed the war game, which is different than I think a lot of unclassified war games, the outcomes of that, what the casualties were in and how that relates to the operational outcome, and then what we think that means. And I'll particularly focus on the Marine Corps for this one. So it was funded through a generous grant by Smith Richardson. So we're very grateful for them for funding our research here, based off of the system that Eric and I have been working on for several years now, and did 24 games on U.S. Fighting China during an attempted invasion of Taiwan, and then one of just Taiwan stands alone. And we varied the different scenarios and assumptions between each one of these games in order to allow to test, okay, what assumptions are consequential, what really makes a difference, if this changes, what really changes the meter on the results and the outcomes, and then got to try out a bunch of different strategies that way too. So a few things about scope conditions. Academics, we're kind of I've been steeped in PhD land for a while, so they've taught me how to be tedious. So we want to say that this is not inevitable, right? That it's not guaranteed that war will occur between the U.S. and China. There are many other things that China could do, like a blockade or some sort of coercive bombardment campaign. We only looked at conventional conflict, not nuclear escalation, although people obviously often brought up the nuclear parameters. The only thing that would, in fact, on the operational fight is decisions about trying to avoid certain escalatory measures, like striking the Chinese mainland. And some games we played that the U.S. was not allowed to strike the mainland because of fears of nuclear escalation. And that we're not making an argument for or against the U.S. defense of Taiwan. We're just trying to provide people with what we see as the most rigorously derived facts we can about what this campaign might look like. So for this wargame system that Eric and I have been building, there's thousands of counters. It's set in 2026. Each turn, there's an operational map, that's 600 kilometers across, and then a actual map of Taiwan that we'll look at in a second here. So we have everything from cyber, space, aircraft, surface ships, ground forces, down to submarines. Try to have holistic models of all of those elements of warfare and bring them together through the war game. So the map's very large. It's not a particularly fun or riveting game. Maybe Dan will disagree, but it's designed to be analytically rigorous and not necessarily to be fun. Another big feature of it is that each turn is 3.5 days, where normally in a lot of war games and DoD war games, the turns will be maybe 12 hours, maybe even maybe a day, and that you try to get through 3 days or something. But this tries to go through the whole scope of a campaign over 3-4 weeks to try and get a better feel about what the operation looks like. On the Taiwan map, you can see there's individual battalions are laid out. In this one, it doesn't Red's trying to establish a beachhead in the south. They've got some paratroopers who are being surrounded by Taiwanese reinforcements, and they've seized Penghu in this particular game that we've got a snapshot of, rather. But that each one of these rules that we do is based on operations research rather than game playability. So when we look at Eric and I have been looking at historical conflicts, projected models of weapons effectiveness, and then try to integrate those together through modeling and simulation in order to come out with a percentage likelihood of, for example, if you're 1 kilo submarine searching in a 600 kilometer across box, and there's this CSG carrier strike group there, going in a random pattern, when are you likely to find it? And you get a distribution of outcomes after you run that simulation 10,000 times, and then translate that into a 20-sided die roll, right? And I'll get a little bit more detail into some of these in the next couple slides to give people an idea about our data sources and how we model those together, right? So if you ever wanted to launch an anti-ship cruise missile, which is something the Marine Corps is very excited about, that you have different data sources. There's different steps that are all probabilistic, that are all stochastic events, right? And so you look through history and from different data sources about what they project those probabilities to be. So you can read here just as well as I can. There's sort of failures to launch, failures to travel of missiles. Then there's interception through different phases, long-range interception with Standard Missile 2, then with ESSM, then with the CWIS, then some sort of NOLCA or electronic warfare. Terminal guidance, a lot of times seekers don't work. What percentage of the time is that? And then some model of damage, how much that would do to a ship, right? So we get probabilities from all these different sources for all the different phases, run those through a Monte Carlo simulation 10,000 times, and then get a table of results that we think is the best informed that we could, so that every time we roll a 20-sided die, we can get, okay, if you fired 25 missiles, how many of these leaked through and struck a ship, and what were the results? And you roll the die and see where you come out with. Another example that is very critical to the game is attacks on air bases with tactical ballistic missiles. So this is one where historical data is obviously not that great. I mean, obviously, in the wake of Qasem Soleimani, the Iran attacked us and al-Assad, but we didn't have a lot of aircraft there. There's indications that we got prior warning. So this requires a lot more speculation based on hypothetical weapon performance, right? So this is if the DF 16, I believe, in this picture, right, which sort of has seems to have a comparable warhead size to a Tomahawk, and it spread cluster munitions had a similar number of submunitions in the same rate as a Tomahawk of comparable class. That could cover an area about this size of a circle, right? So then you say, how many circles would you need to completely cover all the tarmac at, and this is Jazdif Nuta Baru, which is one of our favorite bases in Kyushu, right? So this is how we come up with, okay, this is the number of missiles that you would need in order to completely cover all the possible tarmac space at Nuta Baru. And then, of course, there's interception before then. There's some amount of planes that are up in the air, etc. However, we try to just come up with the best models that we can of these events, even if there's not good historical analogies. Then we get to actually playing the game. We have just a US and China team. Most of these games, Eric and I are just playing by ourselves and trying out different strategies and different scenarios. But sort of half the games, we got outside players like Dan to come and play, who would give us different insights about how they think, what they think optimal strategies might be. They would try out different things, give us feedback about the rules and our assumptions. And so in that way, we're sort of able to refine our project with the help of these subject matter experts here. So the outcome, there's sort of two different parts of it, right? There's the operational outcome, and then the casualties. So here we'll deal with the operational outcome first, which is that in the base scenario of what we thought were the most likely conditions, blue either has an outright victory or there's a stalemate on the island leaning blue. And what that means is that there's still tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers on the island of Taiwan, but that they are cut off. The amphibious fleet is almost completely destroyed. And so then it's a sort of a matter of time before then you need to start looking at peace off ramps, right? Where how do you get this war to stop with some amount of face saving to try to not go to that nuclear step, right? So in any case, you have to go very pessimistic in order for the U.S. to lose, right? Obviously, Taiwan stands alone. China can do that. But you almost have to go to the most extreme scenario of Japan not allowing the U.S. to base forces in order for this to not work for the U.S. However, despite the operational outcome, you're still going to have much higher losses of equipment than we saw during the war on terror, and maybe personnel casualties in 3 weeks of fighting probably equal to maybe half or 3/4 of what we lost during all the 20 years of Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So this just lays out how many aircraft the U.S. and Japan are going to lose in these in the base scenario, what we think is most likely, pessimistic scenarios, and then optimistic scenarios that favor blue, and how many ship losses, right? So China not losing as many aircraft because the Chinese plan really is built around destroying U.S. aircraft in Japan, but they're obviously going to lose a lot more ships because they start off with all their navy over there, and destroying the ships is the critical seam in their plan, right? So a few overall conditions that need to happen in order for blue to succeed in this. One is Taiwanese ground forces need to hold the line. There's any work towards asymmetry of air forces and seaborne forces is certainly helpful, because right now their Navy and their Air Force are probably going to be destroyed within the initial few days. But the ground forces need to stay intact. And if the ground forces don't, then there's almost no way for blue to prevent the landing. Next, there's no Ukraine model for Taiwan. We can't just say, oh, well, we're going to supply Taiwan and we're not going to get directly involved and But any sort of delay gets the worst of all possible worlds, where China gets a very strong foothold ashore and then the U.S. suffers more casualties and has greater risk of escalation at the end of that. By delaying 2 weeks, you make the war go on longer, and you're still at war with China, except with an actually increased risk of there being an operational failure, that they get Taiwan and you're at war with them anyway. Third condition is Japan. The Excessive Forces Agreement is somewhat ambiguous. It says that the U.S. must consult with Japan. Consultation is sort of ambiguous. Does that mean that they need to give us permission? Does that just mean that we need to tell them what our plans are? Certainly Japan's military and diplomatic thinking seems to be that they would go with us, or that they certainly would allow U.S. forces to operate out of U.S. bases in Japan, but that's a critical condition. And finally, the U.S. has to have this mass long-range strike capability. And that this becomes an almost too easy exercise if we have thousands of long-range anti-ship missiles like the JASSM-ER, but that if the JASSM-ER does not work against ships, then this becomes a much more difficult project, right? My dogs decided to move around some books in the background, but I'm almost done here. So what does this mean for the Marine Corps in particular? So I've just laid over the southern and northern beaches on Taiwan, the range of the Naval Strike Missile, right? So this just makes the point that there aren't partners or allied countries that have territory within range of the Naval Strike Missile on these beaches, right? So we are not going to be able to pre-deploy to Yonaguni and be able to reach the northern beach with Naval Strike Missiles. Furthermore, I mean, that probably would be a difficult political ask in the first place. But following on to that, once in terms of getting U.S. Marines to Taiwan after the fact, China's obviously developed some very sophisticated ISR. You have the over-horizon backscatter radar, the Xiaogan series of constellations, in addition to AEW, and that there's a lot of facile talk about or not facile, but sort of simple talk about the U.S. Marines. We're going to move around and we're going to be nimble and agile. That just sort of ignores these difficult problems. Now, China has very delicate kill chains also, but that it's going to be very difficult to count on those not working and us being able to defeat them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan, who will be able to comment on his time as a player and what he thought.
Sure, I can make some just general broad comments about the iteration that I played. And first, Major Brown, thanks again for having me on the Broadcast. It's great to be here. And Matt, congratulations to you and all of your co-authors on getting the report out, and a job well done on this. So my general comments are, and I think Matt covered a lot of them in his presentation, but in the iteration that I played, I believe it was one of the more pessimistic scenarios, wherein China had a strong first strike advantage and carried out several large strikes on U.S. forces in different positions. The primary one there being on Guam. So the overall trend that was noticed in the iteration was that wherever the U.S. amassed force was where China would strike, with the exception of Japan. And that was because in that game, we actually elected to pull assets off of Japan in order to make that prize less valuable for China to strike, which essentially meant that Japan stayed out of the fight for at least the first week, I believe it was, until enough assets flowed there to warrant a Chinese strike on the bases there. Some of the other things, like Matt mentioned, there's a range issue involved with getting close to Taiwan and still being able to strike. But what we saw good value in was in MLRs on some of those farther out islands, being able to strike ships that were creating a picket line on the eastern side of the Taiwanese island. So there is some value there, at least in the game that we played. But again, limited in terms of munitions as well as range in itself. The other big component to this was submarine warfare played a really large role, at least in the initial phase of trying to break some of that picket line and trying to get access to the island from Blue's side. And then from there, again, as Matt mentioned, it really became how many long-range anti-ship missiles do you have in your inventory that you can actually carry over carrying out strikes with things like B-2s and B-52s for long-range strike from Alaska. So you have to have a tanker bridge set up, and then you're firing from long-range standoff range to actually strike either ports or ships on their way over. So those are some broad takeaways just to get us kicked off. But Ian, over to you on some specific questions.
All right, great, and thank you to Matt, and Dan both for laying the stage here. But I had a couple of initial things to get out there, and I guess Matt, the first one to you is for all the different iterations of the game. Like, what was the total time frame you guys were gaming out? You know, with every turn being 3.5 days, were you looking at outcomes over weeks, over months? And with that, were there any other political, diplomatic, economic assumptions or considerations either at the very beginning or the very end of that time frame for those games that potentially influence player decision making, you know, during the game? You know, like if I know I'm only going to play a game for a month, I might not have certain diplomatic or economic considerations, whereas if the game like went for a year of game time.
Most of the games we played for 3 or 4 weeks. In terms of assumption, how a longer war would play out, I don't think that. So right, we're just focused on this operation, right? So it's the first battle of the next war, and this sort of larger. Well, where does it go from there? Does China just do you find some off ramp of, well, China declares victory and you bring back the soldiers to the mainland, and you give them some sort of face saving bilateral meetings, and you're able to get to some sort of new peaceful status quo? Or does this keep going forward? The problem with it, keep going forward, this argument is that if you try the invasion and you fail, you saw the Chinese ship losses numbers that, they've lost over 100 major surface combatants. They can't really go forward. It's not like, well, you're going to try the invasion. If the invasion fails, then we'll go to blockade. You've really lost that capability. So I don't think that there's the extended timelines is as relevant to the success of an invasion as it is to other things. In terms of other sort of political assumptions, so people ask, well, what about NATO? What about Europe? And completely irrelevant to the operations in the first month, right? And even if they had advanced warning, and they tried to sail the Queen Elizabeth all the way to the other end of the ocean, it'd be like the Russian Baltic fleet, like the fleet that had to die. It's like adding one LHA to the mix does not do anything. So these sort of a lot of these discussions miss out on the sort of the larger point. And then the other thing is, if China takes the island, there's no going back. It's impossible for the U.S. to retake it. So that I think that in terms of the fate of Taiwan, it is decided within weeks, and that past that, it's not relevant.
Yeah, if I can just add something really quick as well. So Matt mentioned the partners, places like European partners, how they didn't play in, but I also, and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, Australia, I don't believe even played in this scenario beyond potentially being able to base out of there for a long range strike. And I think one of the reasons for that as well is that tyranny of distance, of actually being able to flow your assets to that AOR or to Taiwan specifically in that short of a time frame is incredibly difficult across those really long ranges. And it's also one of the reasons why, when we had to decide, okay, and full clarity, I played blue, but when we decided where we were going to conduct our long range strike out of, Alaska was actually almost equidistant to Taiwan from Australia. So the distance there is really tremendous.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. I was scribbling this down, but it kind of ties into the first one in the chat here from Baskins, and so I'll try to sort of tie the two together. My question was, how were command and control, command authorities, and different national approaches to things like independent decision making? American side, we teach mission command and pushing authority down. I would imagine the PLA is more of a centralized control authority. but was any of that framework put into how the players interacted? And then this ties in the question from the chat, which is talking about the will to fight in terms of, how are American Taiwanese, American Taiwan allied or supporters versus PLA, their morale and their ability to sort of stand to on the battle in this very intensive, highly violent battlefield. Were those sort of two pieces included at all in any of the scenarios?
Yeah, so we tried to get to will to fight in a couple excursion cases, either modeling that the Chinese through SOF and cyber were able to decapitate the Taiwanese government and then implement delays where other theaters commanders weren't able to support each other for some period of time. And then in terms of sort of poor national will to fight, that they, in some excursions, they fought at sort of 75% effectiveness of comparable sized Chinese forces. So those are sort of, with the excursion cases, are the ways that we tried to slice at these different issues of, well, would C2 work better? Would it work worse? We talk about, right, we project a lot of capabilities to China, but they do have this very rigid hierarchical system, and they have to execute some very tenuous kill chains in a very quick time in order to get U.S. surface ships. So so it's not 100% obvious that this is going to work to their advantage, being a highly, and then you have an advantage, a situation where they get on the beach, and the commissar says go right, and the military commander says go left, and you this could not work out at all for them. So, yeah.
Okay, so I got one last question, and then I'll just start going through the ones in the chat here. But when I talked about the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and the Marine Corps participation, was there any United States Army play at all in this? Whether some of those forces might have been rushed to the island initially if there were time, or any attempt to bring in Army forces of any sort afterwards?
Yeah, we had people try to bring Army brigades onto the island. We had an active duty U.S. colonel play one of the games, and he said, I want to bring in a brigade. And we said, okay, there's 42 major surface combatants east of the island. He said, yeah, I'm going. It's like, okay, well, we rolled the die and you ran over a Renhai, okay, and it shot down a third of your aircraft. Do you want to continue? He says, I'm going in. They're like, okay, you're running into Chinese cap now, and they shoot down. I mean, they're going to slaughter your C-17s. And we gave them a battalion on the island just sort of out of pity. But anything that doesn't get there before D-Day is not getting there within the first month. And getting forces to there en masse before D-Day is a casus belli, is essentially a declaration of war on China. So I don't see that as very likely.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just was curious because, it's obviously, you just look at it and it's pretty clearly a maritime and an air fight. But I was just curious if there was any effort, any attempt made, and sounds like at least one person tried. Good old college try. Okay, yeah, I'm just going to go through the. Sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, just want to throw something in. That last point that Matt just made it is one of the extreme limiting factors in our ability to actually help Taiwan out pre any sort of conflict. It's that he's right. If we decide to station any sort of army troops or even Marines in an overt capacity on Taiwan, that crosses China's red line in terms of them saying, okay, might be the appropriate time to use military force against the island. And there's multiple red lines that China's laid down, which makes that specific instance of trying to support Taiwan any way we can very, very difficult to achieve. And we're trying to get after it now by selling missile systems, right, in order to make that porcupine strategy. But that falls in that very gray kind of not too much, not too little, just enough to support Taiwan without, ticking China off category. But anything beyond that is dangerous.
Okay, actually, so that actually leads me to kind of a branching part from that question, which is, Matt, I know you'd mentioned that there were some instances where like pieces of the MLR were put on some of the outlying islands of Taiwan, to help extend the range of those missiles and impact the PLA pickets. Were there any instances where there were any attempts to build up forces on some of those Japanese-owned islands that are relatively close to Taiwan, but belong to the Japanese government?
Yeah, so there are some islands. I mean, I showed Yonaguni is the closest island, Japanese island to Taiwan, and it still is not within range of the beaches, right? So you're talking about the Chinese trying to maybe go through the Ryukyus, and that we have pre-positioned some forces there, and that they haven't figured that out, and then maybe you get some shots in at them. Um, it's just also not a lot of missiles too. So if you have a whole MLR and you replace the cannons, I don't think they've quite finalized it, but if you replace the cannons one for one with of a regiment, one for one with these Nemesis, right? That's 36 missiles on 18 of the JLTVs, and then you maybe have one or two reloads. In the scheme of these things, this battle, that's not that many. So it might be more useful as a recon element, but then you're talking about, well, what do you really, unless you have over the horizon radars, over the horizon passive sensors, maybe would be helpful. But that other than that, is sort of utility is pretty limited.
Okay, and then were there any sort of back to Dan's points, like the red lines, like would any possible buildup on those Japanese islands, would that have changed, or did it change, the Chinese force posture at all in any of the scenarios?
No, I don't think it's very significant. It's damaging, certainly, but it's not a significant variable.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, I'm done with my set, so I'm going to start going through just the ones here. First one from Francis Heritage is asking about how sea mining was taken into consideration in any of these scenarios, especially for the Taiwan stands alone scenario. And, just again, looking at the map, obviously mines could play a significant role in impacting a possible landing.
Yeah, so the sea mines on both sides were deployed. The Chinese primarily, we believe, would try to do them as an anti-submarine measure to isolate their amphibious force against U.S. SSNs. The Taiwans face a difficult problem where they have to then decide that the war is coming by putting mines out into the Taiwan Straits, right? So you can't ever be 100% sure that the Chinese are bluffing or that they're actually going to try to attack you at this point. And you have to then make that decision that yes, this is the time that the balloon's going up, and we're going to put sea mines between us and them. So it's very politically difficult. And then sea mines, it's not just that one or two of them. Certainly, I mean, you can hurt ships, but in order to have militarily decisive effects, if you look at historical minefields, you're talking about thousands of sea mines, right? And the Chinese also have plans to deal with sea mines. That this is part of their force. So I think that it would be very helpful for Taiwan to develop this sea mining capability, but that it presents them with very difficult political decisions.
And I guess kind of with that, what about, mining undertaken by, I guess going back to, sort of Dan's point, like the U.S. Navy or Air Force could not put mines out in the straits before the conflict. That would be an obvious casus belli. But after the fact, were there any attempts by U.S. Navy or Air Force players in these scenarios to seed additional mines from our side, or do we not have enough mines to really contribute to that in a meaningful fashion?
So yeah, the problem is, like, what are you putting them there with, right? You're obviously not getting surface ships there. You're not getting any U.S. surface ships within hundreds of nautical miles of Taiwan. You'd be lucky to get it within FA-18 sortie range for one sortie. And then are you going to try and fly your F-18 over all these Chinese surface ships in order to drop mines? No, you'd rather fire some longer range missile. So there's a quick strike ER, extended range quick strike, that's sort of modified. You're talking about maybe 40 kilometers range. But unless we were to develop some sort of powered quick strike is this family of air delivered mines that we have. Unless you developed a powered quick strike, that it wouldn't be very beneficial. But I do think that a powered quick strike would be very helpful. But this is the sort of it requires the Air Force to take on an anti-naval mission that it's somewhat loath to do. So it's one of these things that doesn't happen despite being probably a good idea.
Great, thank you. Okay, I have a couple questions here from several audience members, so I'm going to pull these ones together. But this goes kind of into more detail about the other regional powers and potential allies. And I'm going kind of from the bottom up here, but we know, like, in the last few days, obviously after the games were played out, but there's been a sort of a change in the Philippines agree to expand American basing down there. For either one of you, were there any decisive or significant actions by either being able to base things in the Philippines or other countries in that region that had a significant impact one way or the other on the scenarios that were played? And we talked about the tyranny of distance, and also obviously, like, if Japan says you cannot use your bases, that makes everything else very, very hard. But were there some variants in which a significant allied basing or permission to do something had a significant effect?
So, obviously our other ally is Korea, but I would be very, if you could find a Korean expert who said that they would want to be involved in this fight, I would be shocked, because the ones that we talk to say, no, we have no interest in doing this whatsoever. So the Philippines has this additional basing. It'll be interesting to see what this actually means in practice. They're obviously very worried about a South China Sea contingencies. Obviously, the maritime militia has been pushing them out of fishing areas, expanding these shoals. And so I think that there's some, I think that's what they're concerned about. They're not as concerned about getting involved in a intervention over Taiwan. And certainly it would be helpful to have additional military airports that are within range, but that these are equally within range of Chinese land attack missiles, the same ones that can cover Honshu and Kyushu, right? So that it's helpful to have additional ramp space that the Chinese would need to bombard, but that certainly not a game changer. If you look at if you remember the map that I put up earlier, if you got to this island in the Bashi Strait in the Philippines, then certainly that would give you good naval strike missile if you're talking about an MLR. And probably the Chinese are going to have to transit some ships through there in this contingency, so that would be helpful. But that's again talking about doing that beforehand to get permission to go to this island and then place Marines.
Thanks, Dan. From the game you played, anything to add or elaborate on that?
So just thinking about the iteration I played, I don't think we had access in the Philippines. I think there might have been like one MLR somehow made its way onto one of the islands over there. So it didn't really play into that scenario. But even speaking more broadly about real world applications of this, I mean, Matt covered almost everything that's relevant to it. But one of the other key things to think about is the combat radius of aircraft that are even on the Philippines, and the potential for having to tank those aircraft if they can't make a full trip, or at least, if they're engaged in a dogfight over or running cap over Taiwan, they're going to use a lot of fuel. They're going to need some sort of refueling to get back. And tankers are very vulnerable, right? So it all depends on how you can flow your logistics to support that effort over the island while still being survivable. But I think, bottom line is that Matt said it right. A lot of those bases are already within the strike range of missiles based in mainland China. So they'll have some effect, but I think primarily for the South China Sea rather than Taiwan.
Great, thank you. Okay, again, bundling a couple of questions here together. You're gaming out a scenario with potentially in a region where there's lots of different countries that are going to have interest or security concerns. Did you bring in any players from any of those sort of regional governments, military or civilian staffs? And obviously Japan would probably, getting them in the room would be significant. Did you have any Australians, it sounds like probably not any South Koreans, but any of those other nations there that would potentially be involved or impacted? Were they players at any point in any of these games?
Yeah, we had people from the Taiwan, cultural office because they don't have an embassy, right? So they've a civilian who is a fellow at CSIS and a Marine officer from the Taiwanese Marine Corps who played a few times and gave us some great insights about the geography and things that we were missing about the navigability of the mountains in particular, and what some of these beaches look like. And we just ran, Eric and I just ran the game in Tokyo for the last week with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So it's interesting to see how right, people from different backgrounds approach the problem, but that you're fundamentally constrained. I think that different cultural backgrounds are more relevant in a competition phase. There's a lot more ideas, room for diversity of ideas, but that once you start firing missiles and launching air sorties at each other, you're sort of governed by some hard physics about missiles and aircraft ranges, as Dan was talking about.
Thank you, Dan. Were there any of those representatives in your game at all you want to talk about or discuss their inputs?
No, not really. Unfortunately, it would have been great to play with some folks from either Taiwan or Japan. But I think, just speaking more broadly, the class that I just wrapped up teaching at Marine Corps University, China's Grand Strategy, there is, when it comes to different phases of this, even pre-conflict or even post-conflict, right? There's different ways of looking at it and gaming out how does China and the US still compete even after something like Taiwan pops off, that it's hard to wrap your mind around unless you understand the cultural components too. So I think, Matt, your efforts in Japan are fantastic, and it would be awesome if you could tour that around to many of those Southeast Asian or even Northeast Asian countries and see how each side looks at the issue. And I think that would give us a more robust and holistic view of how we can get after the problem from the US side.
All right, next question from Nate that I'm going to pull in here, and this goes into any potential insights or lessons. And I'm going to go Marine Corps specific here to the audience. If you're not Marine Corps, if that's not your thing, then you can tune out the next 5 minutes or so. But insights in terms of how the MLRs were employed, where they could be employed. As well as not just the MLR, but some of the other Force Design 2030 initiatives that are going on across the Marine Corps, because the MLR is just like one piece of the larger project here. And obviously I realized this game was not intended to test out those concepts. Like, this is a theater thing, and Marines are only going to be a part of that, a smaller part of that anyway. But was there anything that came up or that you could expand on here from the iterations that were run?
Yeah, so I guess I'll, there's obviously a lot of there's two bitterly opposed camps, it seems like, on Force Design 2030. So I'm trying not to offend anyone, but I think it's really good that the Marine Corps is oriented on this fight. The problem is just moving ground forces within any side is just very difficult in this age of long range precision strike. And so when you talk about let's get a ship to to an island that's within 100 kilometers of where Chinese ships are going to be, and then we'll offload a JLTV with missiles on it, and then have the missiles JLTV fire. It's sort of the question arises: well, why wouldn't you just have the ship fire the missiles in the first place? That's just firing the missiles with extra steps. Certainly. So the primary advantage is if you're able to be somewhere in the first place with those ground forces, because then you blend into the ground cover, right? And you're much more survivable. Problem is the political realities, and asking around, about Chinese experts like Dan and others, like, what do you think about putting Marines on Taiwan beforehand? No, you got a pretty hard. Maybe the U.S. will decide to effectively declare war on China and put soldiers and Marines on Taiwan. And that would be militarily, operationally very beneficial, but that it's just obviously has great political risks. I think that the MLR is a good asset to have. It's certainly better for this scenario than a traditional Mu. But that if you're talking about how many of these we should have, how much we should redesign the force structure towards this, probably not. You don't need the whole force structure to be designed around this because you sort of get limited utility out of it. So I sort of come down in the middle of like, yeah, let's have some force design 2030, particularly if you're in Okinawa, and then you roll the political dice. You never know what's going to happen beforehand. We're not the policymakers, but that sort of banking the whole Marine Corps around the idea and getting rid of the ability to take care of other contingencies is probably harmful.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think we're, just from what I've seen, I don't think we're going that way anyway. But it's the focus on, for one of the MEPs at least out there, to have this as a possible asset. And, I guess, like you said, better to have it than not have it out there at least. Dan, in your scenario, were there any specific, again, sorry everyone else, but Marine Corps centric lessons or insights that you got out of the game that you played?
Speaking about the game, not particularly. I am not a Force Design 2030 expert. You guys are well versed in that. I'm still trying to just be okay in Marine Corps University and stick to China stuff for this point in time. Don't want to get involved in the debate around 2030, but I will throw this out there. I just wrapped up a workshop with the Hudson Institute that was focused on trying to figure out ways to dissuade China. And there's a bottom line in the information world whenever you're looking at ground forces within Asia writ large. And we'll stick with the Philippines for this, is that if you put US forces anywhere on the Philippines specifically, there's always the odd chance that somebody walking around with a cell phone will snap a photo of US forces there and send it off to their friend group. And then that information, because China controls a lot of the information, will eventually trickle its way over to China and they'll know where you're positioned. So I want to credit Mike Dom for pointing that one out, but that's something that we need to take into a consideration when we're thinking about, if you have ground-based forces within China's strike range and they know that they're being held at risk. So it is a very, very difficult problem to get over, not only just getting forces over there in the first part, but also maintaining or at least obfuscating that they are there, because otherwise they're going to be held at risk.
Yeah, and I think that's a point to bring out as well, to maybe not to those newer deployments to an expanded presence in the Philippines, but to those established bases like the places in like Okinawa or Guam or Iwakuni, things like that. Like I'm anecdotal speculation, but I'm 100% confident that somebody in China knows how many rivets are on each of the the F-35s or the the F-22, or I guess we don't have F-22s anymore out at Kadena. We used to joke. I was based out of Futema for one of my UDPs, and we knew there was somebody like right outside the fence line, just like taking notes through binoculars every time we went to do a training mission. So yeah, that kind of stuff is already at risk. So I'd imagine inserting anything new, you'd want to keep it murky at least as long as you could, but that's definitely hard when they probably have, as you said, all kinds of just open source collection capabilities there. Okay, moving on. Next question. I'll try and get through a couple more, and then we'll just take a look at the time. Look at wrapping it up here in about at the hour. So from Aaron Danis, and this gets into what is obviously a huge consideration in this, and that's the logistics of this first battle here, right, for both sides. So a question is, for both players, red and blue, when did they run out of initial stockpiles of munitions? Or was there any attempt to sort of manage expenditures so that you would have maybe more, on the, week 3 and onward, rather than shooting everything in weeks 1 and 2? So what were some of those lessons and some of those insights specifically about the initial logistics laydown, and then how how much, if any, you could resupply after the initial expenditures?
Yeah. So I'll start with China's logistic difficulties, which are massive, right? You've got to move a bunch of people. If you just look at the first 3 days, this looks really good for China, right? Because you've got this huge amphibious fleet. You can move a bunch of people onto Taiwan. You've got a whole range of missiles. You can cover all of the military airfields in Honshu and Kyushu several times over. So, life looks great. But then you're going to run out of missiles. And obviously we have to estimate from the CMPR about what those missile numbers are. But that becomes very difficult. And then you've got to resupply these troops that you've moved over onto Taiwan. And you look at Normandy and Okinawa, and these historic invasions require constant streams, and the offload rate is always much lower than you think it's supposed to be. So China has huge logistics problems that make the day 4 look different, very different than day 3. On the U.S. side, right, this is part of another question. Even if you had an MLR on Taiwan, unless you brought over lots of reloads for them, they're going to run out of missiles very quickly. So if you had an MLR of 18 with 18 Nemesis, 36, that's 36 missiles in the tubes, you brought over, let's say 2 reloads, that's 100 missiles, which is, great. That's not anything to sneeze at. But a squad, 12 B-52s is coming over with what, 450 missiles, 450 JASM, so one MLR is not going to probably have, that's deployed forward to stick with the Marine Corps theme, is probably not going to have the firepower that we're looking at in this contingency, right? There are other contingencies, and we're just looking at one amphibious invasion of Taiwan. And then, in terms of global U.S. stockpiles, they're woefully inadequate. In terms of long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, we're building this huge inventory of JASM-ER, the long-range that's a land attack cruise missile, but that its ability to strike maritime targets is not clear. There's certainly no new statements that they're trying to reprogram a lot of them to do that. But that this mission of attacking ships, the Air Force hasn't really brought it on board as much as they should, and that really needs to become the main focus for them.
Thanks. And then Dan, for your game, what was going on with your logistics there for both players?
Honestly, I think Matt covered it pretty well. The same idea happened in our game. China shot a bunch of their missiles off. Originally, their longer range ones, so like I said, the ones that could strike Guam, but then very quickly they had very few of those left. They still had some of their longer range anti-ship missiles, which kept carriers at bay. And then once we had enough assets on Japan and they decided, okay, let's bring Japan into the fight, they very, very quickly had at least 1 or 2 runs over each of the airstrips that they wanted to target. But that was largely it, right? And then after that, and this is where with Matt's Wargame, the time really played into account, was that after, we'll call it week 2, after the airstrikes on the Japanese airfields, then there were no missiles to actually strike anything that we as the blue side flowed onto the islands after we did some rapid runway repair, and then we could operate pretty freely out of Japan. So that was an interesting lesson. If you can bait it out and absorb that first strike without losing too many of your own blue assets, then you can follow on and really flood at least the airspace over Taiwan and eventually have blue dominance in the airspace there. And then that applies also to ships, right? There's only so many anti-ship missiles that China does have that they can shoot. And if you have more ships than missiles, and it's not a 1-for-1 trade-off, right? Like not every single missile hits or has the desired effect, then you can eventually flow enough forces. And that's where the strength of blue lies, right? It's having enough forces to be able to flow through a theater over a period of time to actually achieve the objective. Whereas red is, right now at least, is very much positioned for a short, fast fight. And, they call it winning, local informationized wars. So local means just constraining it to a specific geographic area and also making sure that there's limited players in the fight. and they want to win or fight and win very, very quickly, which in this type of scenario does not end up happening.
Great. Thank you both. Okay, I got one last question, and then I'll turn it back to both of you gentlemen for any closing comments you wanted to make. But this kind of, I'm getting away from outcomes of the scenarios and more to get your insights and thoughts on sort of the construct and method of this war game, which were these series of games, which was, unclassified, done on open source, openly available, publicly available data. And, it's still the way it was executed, in multiple iterations. It generated a lot of data that we could chew on and have this sort of open discussion. So I guess a question kind of is, based on how this came out, is this something that, other parts of either the DoD or sort of larger national security enterprise should look at doing more of these in this construct to, one, it's probably easier. Like, it's easier to pull together open source data to build something than have to go through and, figure out what's classified and see if you need to classify it. I think there's also the fact that we're here talking about it. There's a level of, sort of transparency and access to a wider audience for that. But do you think that the value of this is something that should be potentially done more, looking at this problem set, so we can have these kinds of discussions and also, bringing other people into the room who may not necessarily be able to get access to the room and share insights if it's at a higher level of classification?
Yeah, I think that bringing the war gaming, there's a lot of debate about what's the purpose of war game, what is a war game, what isn't. We try to, we try to categorize war games by purpose, and having an analytical war game like this that's not played for player education, that's not played for an enjoyment, that's not played for a political military. We're gonna brainstorm new ideas. I think this is we would like to argue that it's a valid form of wargaming. John Compton from Cape, OSD Cape, has written a little bit about this and given some talks. And I absolutely think we're in great agreement with him about the need for iterated analytic war games where it's not designed to be a whole experience that people will come together and enjoy, but that it's an analytic exercise. I think that it certainly is better for policymakers to be informed by secret level and TS level games, so that if DoD that DoD would be well served to have more of these, and where you can refine different PKs based on real operational testing data and secret sources. So I definitely think that this is a tool that should be going forward.
Thanks, Dan. Anything to add to that?
One thing that I would add is, Matt, maybe for you it was very analytical and not so fun, but playing one iteration of it, that was pretty fun. So I think there was good value in that. Beyond that, I do think that there's value in having this kind of war game with the policy community, because I feel, generally speaking, that sometimes it's difficult to get policymakers and no kidding warfighters like you gentlemen in the room and have conversations and run through things together. It seems like at least wargaming a lot of times is mainly the military community or some avid fans within the policy realm, but having this kind of forum for that discussion, I believe, is very beneficial and helps us really get after thinking through this as a whole of government or whole of society.
Great. All right. Thanks to both of you. So we've been going for about an hour. I do want to respect everybody's time. So any final closing thoughts from either of you before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I just say this isn't the final word, and this isn't all encompassing. There's so much more research to be done, even on the military problem. Like, what does the South China Sea fight look like? What does a blockade scenario look like? What does a Senkaku scenario look like? How are these all different? I think that there's scope for a project of this size to be done about any number of those contingencies, and that's just like off the top of your head, military contingencies involved in China. These could be done for other ones. And so definitely don't want people to walk away with like, well, we've done that. Good. No, nobody needs to look at China military scenarios ever again. So I definitely look forward to people building on what we've done and taking it to the next level.
So final thoughts. Once again, Matt, great job on the war game. It was honestly a lot of fun to play, and I think has helped bring the debate within the media to a higher level of thinking through these things analytically, really getting after the problem. I also want to say, Ian, I know the Krulak Center, and especially under your leadership, we are getting after trying to war game the different scenarios like Senkakus, the South China Sea. So hopefully that can really expand out a little bit farther into the broader community as well. And there's obviously some natural synergy between the work that you two do. So thanks again for having me on, and hopefully we can continue to get after this difficult problem.
Great, thanks, Dan. And yeah, at the Krulak Center, where one of our mottos probably should be like ABG, always be gaming. And certainly standing invitation to Matt anytime you want to come down and throw out something on this scenario, or Dan can tell you I have a cubicle full of all kinds of other things we could throw it on the table and explore different stuff. All right. Well, to both of you gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. I'm so glad we're able to pull this together, because it's definitely, it's a really timely discussion on a potential future challenge that, certainly on the Marine Corps side, preparing for is a possible thing to look at, but also as the game shows, like everybody's going to be, Navy, Air Force, and all kinds of other people are going to be involved in this, and it's going to be truly a joint problem that has to be looked at. We're definitely going to, I'll put the link to the report again into the show notes once we actually publish this. To the audience, thank you as well for joining us. And I'd also like to say, this has been, this is the second Brewcast I've done this week, and we're not done yet, but I've had a chance on both of the last ones this week to talk to former Marines who've gone on to do great things. Both of them, Matt, yourself, you've got your PhD, and our guest on Monday who talked to us about the Combined Action Program in Vietnam. He's a PhD student. So, hey, to all you Marines out there, these are some of the things you can do after you get out, and it's pretty remarkable, the impact and the problems that you can study once you get out. So something to look forward to. And then speaking of things to look forward to as well, we're not done yet on the Brewcast for this week. So to our audience tomorrow, you want to talk about training and education in the Marine Corps and in the years to come. We're going to have a couple of Marines from Training and Education Command to help dig into some of the meat of the new Training and Education 2030 report, which is kind of the third leg of the triad of larger concepts that are supporting the overall Force Design 2030 project under the Commandant's planning guidance. So please join us for that. It's going to be a good discussion as well, just like this one was. So again, thank you all, and please make sure you join us for the next episode. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.